Okay, so Socrates. I believe the module does a good job of giving you a brief overview of Socrates and sort of his character. Um, what I want to focus on is the conception of virtues as presented by Socrates through Plato's early dialogues, and specifically through the ones that chronicle the last days of Socrates. Um, as a consequence, this video is going to be a little bit on the longer side, probably closer to 15, maybe 20 minutes, and it's mostly narrative, right? It doesn't really expand much on what's in the module itself here, but it does help present a better idea of how Socrates conceived of virtue and consequently how this affected Plato's own understanding and the development of Plato's own ideas. So beginning with the Euthyphro dialogue, the topic being piety, right? And piety it just means being pious, right? Honoring the gods. The virtues sort of extolled within and explored within the Euthyphro dialogue are wisdom, temperance, and justice. Right. So quick deviation here. The four Platonic virtues, quote unquote, are wisdom, temperance, justice, and courage. And temperance is another way of saying moderation, right? Moderation of bodily desires, not overindulgence. And it's usually used with regard specifically to bodily desires, but it also means temperance in, lifestyle as a result. Okay. So in the Euthyphro dialogue, Socrates is actually on his way to his trial, which is the next dialogue in the sequence, the Apology. And when he runs across his young friend Euthyphro, right, who is on his way to court or to seek legal advice to sue his father, just because Euthyphro kind of wants land, more or less, right? He wants more from daddy than daddy's willing to give. And Euthyphro is one of those young, rich aristocrats that Socrates surrounded himself with, and so was Plato, for that matter. And he's going to bring, his father up on a charge of impiety, right? And so Socrates stops and says, "Oh, hey, Euthyphro, yada yada." They get to chatting, and Euthyphro's like, "Don't you have a thing to do?" And Socrates is like, "Yeah, but it's not important. It just determines my fate, right? No big deal." This is more important. Let's explore the nature of piety, right? And they talk about what it means to be pious, right? And how piety doesn't just refer to um, deference and obedience to the gods, but also within the household, right? So to the order of things, and Socrates eventually basically kind of calls Euthyphro out on his bullshit and shows him how he's being impious by doing this, right? That his father really is doing as much as he can, and that suing his father is kind of really ridiculous. Um, and Euthyphro is convinced, and they go their separate ways, right? That's a very, very Cliff Notes a version of the Euthyphro dialogue, but there are some important aspects that are kind of explored in greater detail. Some important philosophical conundrums are raised in the Euthyphro dialogue, including what's known as the Euthyphro dilemma, right? Which is something right because the gods say it is, and if so, doesn't that make right and wrong arbitrary to the whims of the gods, or is something right regardless of, or do the gods say something is right because it's right regardless of their say so? In which case, why be pious to the gods, right? So it's a bit of a dilemma that they work through within the dialogue, and it's an interesting one, and one that we'll explore in brief once we get to the philosophy of religion section, or and or the study of deontology, depending on which course you're watching for this video. Next is the apology, right? So the whole basis of the apology as a word, right? It's one of our borrow words in English, right? That we took from other languages. Its roots are Greek, and it comes from the Greek word apologia, which means to defend, right? So it's literally Socrates presenting his own defense. You know, the thing that every lawyer tells you you really shouldn't do. Socrates does it, and to rather stellar effect, all told. So he's been kind of brought up on 4 charges, as it were. And, you know, all of them are pretty bunk, right? They're just kind of bullshit. But he's made enough enemies that you know it could actually go through if he doesn't mount a good defense. So the 4 charges are corrupting the youth, not honoring the gods of Athens, and these are called the gods of the city, and these are the new charges, and practicing sophistry and natural philosophy, which are considered the old charges, right? Right. And any one of them can see Socrates kind of like paying a fine or something like that. All of them together can see Socrates exiled or executed, right? And Socrates and these charges have been raised against him by 3 people that he's had interactions with and embarrassed in the process, right? So revenge is a powerful motivator for injustice, right? And Socrates basically goes through and shows that each of these charges in turn is based on absolutely nothing. With regards to the charge of sophistry, so sophistry was the practice of, teaching others, which he did, right, for money, right? Bartering your skills for money to others who were not in your craft, right? This is functionally, the sophists were functionally like the first lawyers. They by and large were individuals who claimed that they could turn any argument into a winning argument, right? And they taught those skills to others or sold their services to that effect. To understand why this is problematic, in Athens, right, up to the point of up until about 100 years or so before, it had been the practice, about 40 years or so before this, it had been the practice that individuals defended themselves in court. That was the way it was, right? So what Socrates is doing, despite being something every lawyer would advise you against today, that was common practice in Athens at the time. And you would present your own case and whatnot, right? So having an expert wordsmith, and that's what they were wordsmiths, people who twisted language, rhetoricians, around and to suit their ends and, win them arguments through linguistic trickery, as it were. Do your argument, argue your case for you in such a way as, to not argue the facts, but to argue semantics and get you off on, a technicality that was frowned upon. Right? Sorry, that makes sophistry one of the new charges. The old charges would have been not honoring the gods of the city and practicing natural philosophy. And so, and the new charges would have been sophistry and corrupting the youth. Right? So, Socrates shows how, yeah, he taught people, but not in the way that, the claim of sophistry would require. He never asked for money from any of these people, from any of the young aristocrats who followed him around, and his method of teaching was literally just being annoying and asking questions until they arrived at their own conclusions, right? Presenting counter arguments to their own points. That was his method of teaching. It wasn't extolling, this is the truth, this is fact. It was, in fact, questioning whether or not anything was the truth or the fact, right? Undermining their existing beliefs and opinions. And then he goes on to address the charge of not believing in the gods of the city, and he shows how this is just absolute bullshit. I mean, he talks about his friend Sheriphon, who went to the Oracle Delphi, and the Oracle asked the question, right, who is the wisest man in all of Athens? And the Oracle said that it was Socrates. Sheriphon comes back, tells Socrates this, and Socrates seeks to prove the Oracle wrong. Well, why would he bother proving the Oracle wrong unless he believed in the gods of the city, right? In the gods of the city, since since the Oracle only holds authority by being the voice of Apollo on Earth, right? And Apollo is the god of prophecy and truth. So if you don't believe that the oracle's telling the truth, and that or the oracle, if you don't believe that the oracle is an authority that needs to be proven wrong, then you don't believe in the gods of the city, i.e., Apollo, Athena, and not Poseidon. I believe Artemis was the other one, for like the three major gods of Athens at the time. So yeah, the very fact that Socrates went out of his way to try and prove the oracle wrong was because he thought the gods were mistaken, right? You can't think that something that you don't believe exists to be mistaken. So, bunch of bunk. And then the charge of practicing natural philosophy. Well, I mean, Socrates asked questions, right? He looked for, in essences, definitions, right? He wanted to get at the true nature of things, including things like truth and, truth, beauty, piety, courage, wisdom, temperance. What do these things mean? What are they? That's not natural philosophy. He's not doing what what Thales and the others did, and saying that this is the way that the world is, and that this therefore invalidates the existence of the gods. Right? He does none of that. And then finally, the last one, and the one that he has the most trouble defending against is corrupting the youth. So when Socrates says that, so what winds up being the case is he argues that he kind of does a little bit of sophistry, right, at this point, and says that the only way I could be corrupting the youth is if there was already a standard by which, my questioning was a corruption, but this is the very thing that youth do to begin with. It was what we did with our own elders, yada yada. And so the most nebulously defined, vague, and ambiguous charge is the one that he ultimately gets caught on, right? The other three get dismissed, but he gets charged with corrupting the youth, and he's offered to pay, and he's sentenced to pay like a 30 mina fine, right? And mina are silver pieces. That's an interesting biblical overlap right there, that Judas was paid 30 silver pieces to betray um, uh, Jesus, and Socrates was told to pay 30 pieces for the betrayal of Athens, when really the people of Athens are betraying him. Which does lead to some questions of if you're into this sort of biblical historiography, since Socrates came like a couple hundred years beforehand and was a major figure known throughout um, you know the world, ancient Greece, and parts of Asia at the time. Um, how much of the story of the 30 silver pieces is true, and how much of it is, connecting Jesus to the tale of Jesus, the betrayal of Judas, to the betrayal of another major figure, right? Sort of using similarities. Okay, that's beside the point. Where was I? Oh, right. So one of the things that it was common in Greek court at this time, in the Athenian court, was if a person being charged, right, sentenced, was of great enough renown, they had done enough for the city, they could propose an alternative sentence. And Socrates had done many great things during the war with during Athens' last war with Sparta, and as a result, he was given leeway to propose his own alternative sentence. And Socrates comes out and says, "Okay, well, as the punishment should fit the crime, I think that what my punishment should be is to be locked within the Parthenon with all the other great Athenian heroes, and fed, waited on hand and foot for the remainder of my days until I die." Right? Socrates basically finally loses his shit and lashes out, right? In the most absurdly polite way possible. Um, and then he gets pulled aside by his friends, including, friends slash students, including Plato, who say, "No, Socrates, look, if it's a matter of not having the money, take the fine. Don't piss anyone else off. We will pay the fine for you. Just don't fucking upset anyone." And Socrates comes back and says, "Okay, I was out of line there. I'll pay the fine." But at this point, he's already managed to piss everyone off, right? And they say, "Nope, death or exile. That's your choice." And he says, "Well, okay, death. Since Athens is my home. I don't want to ever leave it, and I have nowhere to go and so I'd spend the rest of my days in squalor. So death." And that's how we get to the Cryo, which involves one of Socrates' friends, Cryo, trying to spring him from jail the night before his execution, via hemlock smoothie. Right? And so Cryo pays off the guards, pays off a passenger ship, and the captain of the ship and the whole crew. And he pays off another guy to help him smuggle Socrates out. He's spent all this money on helping Socrates escape, and he gets to the jail cell and says, "Hey, come on, Socrates, we got to spring you out of here. I've got travel plans. I've got a house that I own in a nearby, in a town a fair bit away. They'll never find you. You can live out the rest of your days comfortably." And Socrates says, "Cryo, let's sit and talk about the nature of the laws." And Cryo goes, "What the fuck, man? Like, no, we can't sit and talk about the laws. We don't have time. The shift change is about to occur in like an hour, and we gotta get out of here before dawn, or you're stuck and you're gonna die." And Socrates says, "No, no, no. Let's talk about the laws. Right? Why? I want you to understand why this is important to me. Right? Yes, what's happening to me is unjust. But is it the fault of the laws or the people implementing the laws?" Right? And that's how the conversation goes. It's just Socrates more or less talking Crito through the very nature of the laws, and how laws can be unjust versus how the people who enforce them can be unjust. And he ultimately says, yes, the enforcement of these laws are unjust, but I love Athens. I love the city, its peoples, and its laws. Right? And because I love them, I am willing to die for them. Because if by my death and this being implied, if by my death I can reveal the corruption and the faults within my city, that is what I've lived my life for. Right? If I flee now, after having accepted my sentence, I undermine all of that. But if I stand here on principle and die for what I believe in, right, then my point is made all the clearer for it. And Creditor goes, okay, fuck, I'm a lot poorer now. I spent a lot of money on this, but okay, I see where you're coming from, Socrates. And so he leaves. Next day is when the Fado occurs, right? The last of the 4 early dialogues. And the Fado is really just Socrates chilling with his boys, talking about the nature of death. That's all it is, right? There's a little bit of misogyny in there. It starts off a little bit misogynistic, right? Or sexist. Not misogynistic, but sexist. They are distinct, right? Because all of his friends his young friends are crying, because he's about to die, right? And in the hour or so before his death, like, he just calls them out on it and is like, what if I wanted to be surrounded by crying upon on my deathbed, I would have asked for my wife, my mother, and all the other women in my life to be here, right? It's like, look, there's nothing to cry for, nothing to cry over, and they discuss the nature of death, right? Socrates goes, look, there's really 3 things sort of awaiting me in the afterlife, right? If the mythology is right, and then I'll either go to the fields of Elysium or the fields of punishment, right? And I've not done anything so bad to deserve the fields of punishment, and so I don't have like an eternity of torture to, look forward to. But I've certainly done things worthy enough of earning the fields of Elysium, right, as an eternal reward, where I can meet and discuss with all the greatest heroes and leaders and statesmen, um, of our culture, these very questions for all eternity. The things that have driven me, I can discuss with the leading exemplars of each of them. Right? So why would that be something so lamentable? And if they're wrong, if the mythology is wrong and there is nothing awaiting me after death, then why cry for me? Right? If I die and there's nothing after, all I face is oblivion, right? And it is a release from, the suffering of life, essentially. Why cry for someone who's not experiencing any pain or pleasure? Right? They're just no longer. That seems absurd, a thing to do. And that's basically what the conversation is. But this gives you a robust idea of Socrates' character, right? But in every case of these dialogues, certain virtues are sort of being extolled and explored through the dialogues. For the Euthyphro, it's wisdom, temperance, and justice, right? What is the nature of justice? Right? For the Apology, it's wisdom and justice, like the direct one-to-one relationship between the two. For the Cryo, it's wisdom, justice, and courage, right? The courage to stand up for your principles, and how that relates to making the wise decision, and therefore the just decision. And then for the Fado, it's just courage and wisdom, right? Wisdom was a huge thing for Socrates, and it was a huge thing for Plato too, as we'll see next.